2001 El Señor de los Anillos, 2006 Disney compra Pixar, luego los superhéroes, después Netflix, la pandemia, ya no visitas a tu abuela.
El cine se fue a la mierda.
Muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches, muy buenos días, sean muy bienvenidos a su bonito podcast familiar, El cine se fue a la mierda, en su edición número 78. Esta vez les traemos de regreso a Fraser McLean, con la segunda parte de esta entrevista, donde él nos está contando su historia de cómo llegó a ser, pues, llegó a poder trabajar en esas producciones de Disney, de Warner, que todos conocemos como Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Quien Engañó a Roger Rabbit, Space Jam, Tarzan. Hace 2 semanas tuvimos la primera parte de esta entrevista, vayan a verla, por favor, estuvo bastante buena, porque Fraser, pues, nos contó toda su infancia en contacto con la animación, en contacto con el arte, sus primeros contactos, cómo empezó a dibujar, cómo empezó a pintar, cómo empezó a tomar fotos, cómo empezó a editar, cómo se metió en el mundo del cine, de la televisión, cómo estuvo luchando constantemente por poder animar o por poder sacar a la luz proyectos animados o por lo menos poder hacer animación. Y pues la semana pasada nos quedamos en cuando Fraser nos contó cómo logró conseguir su primer trabajo en animación, que fue pues nada más y nada menos que en la película de Quien Engañó a Roger Rabbit, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, esta película que es un híbrido entre acción viva y animación, dirigida por Robert Zemeckis, que es el director de Volver al Futuro. Entonces, bastante interesante que él haya logrado conseguir este trabajo, y también les vamos a pedir que sean un poco pacientes porque Fraser, pues su español es un poco limitado porque él es originario de Escocia, eso ya lo vimos.
Muy limitado.
Ya lo vimos la vez pasada, entonces Fraser nos va a estar contando en inglés y pues nosotros vamos a estar aquí haciendo el esfuerzo de traducir lo que él nos vaya diciendo y nos vaya contando. Vamos a hacerles un pequeño resumen y a lo mejor ya en los podcasts, ya cuando estén diferidos, vamos a ver si podemos tal vez poner subtítulos en español directamente. No sé bien cómo se haga eso, pero si se puede lo vamos a hacer. Si no, pues vamos a tratar de traducirlo lo mejor que podamos y que esto fluya de la mejor manera. Y también pues obviamente nos acompañan Alan y Mace como siempre. ¿Cómo están?
Como siempre.
How are you, Fraser?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm just back from a week in Ciudad de Mexico. First time I've done clases presenciales since before the pandemic, so it was really nice to meet students in person and get back to the big city. But it's also nice to be back in Guadalajara, so I'm fine. How are you?
Where did you teach, Fraser, here?
Well, in February every year, it's the SAI Mexico Aniversario. So it was the Aniversario 12 this year. And I've taken part in all of the anniversaries online during the pandemic, but the first one that I came over to present at was in 2018. So I've done all of them since then. And that was on the Monday and the Tuesday. And so I did a presentation on the Monday evening. I went back to do a drawing workshop on the Wednesday and then a drawing expedition on the Friday. And on the Tuesday and the Thursday, I was on the campus at Escuela Escena. And I've been teaching online for them for 2 years, but I haven't actually visited the campus before. So that was great. It's really cool.
And how was seeing people in the classroom again?
Amazing, wonderful. This whole thing, I mean, this is good. The technology is wonderful, but seeing people in a rectangle and very often just the avatar and the name is not the same as breathing the same air and actually spending time with people. It was wonderful. It's really good.
Nice.
Qué bueno, Fraser nos está diciendo que pues él enseña en Ciudad de México, fue a la Ciudad de México, él enseña en Ciudad de México en línea y fue a la Ciudad de México la semana pasada, por fin logró conocer a sus estudiantes y le gusta mucho la experiencia presencial, respirar el mismo aire que esa gente, y no solo verlos a través de una pantalla, ver sus avatares a través de la pantalla. Entonces vamos a empezar.
You're basically being Brendan Fraser's character on The Whale without the overweight, Fraser.
Do you know, I haven't seen The Whale yet, so I can't say for sure, but I've got to get around to seeing the movie, but I don't know the story, so I take your word for it.
Sorry for the spoiler, but he's an online teacher, so
Ah,
now you
okay.
know something else about the character and the film.
I need to. I've been to the cinema a total of 2 times since I've been in Mexico. So yeah,
Oh.
I need to
Go
get
back,
back out
go
to
back
the
to it.
cinema.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I watched The Whale on the weekend. It was pretty good. Like it's a great film. Darren Aronofsky is so good.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I remember Requiem for a Dream, and he did Pi as well, didn't he?
Yeah, Pi, The Fighter, Black
Mm,
Swan.
yeah.
What was the name of his latest film, with Jennifer Lawrence? Mom?
I didn't see
I
that
think it's
one.
Mom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Andres Ortiz is asking if you didn't get intoxicated the first time you eat tacos.
um, the thing to remember is if you come from Scotland, your history of food is not great. There's a movie called So I Married an Axe Murderer with Mike Myers in it, and his character works in a deli, and he's from a Scottish family, and somebody says, "Why don't you sell any Scottish food in the deli?" And he said, "All Scottish food is based on a dare." So it's like, I dare you to eat that. So la comida mexicana es mucho mejor que la comida escocesa tradicional. But I haven't. I did make the mistake once of accepting somebody's invitation to drink their own brand of mezcal, and I wasn't prepared for how strong it was. And this was somebody that had a chalkboard on the wall of their living room and expected us to draw things on the chalkboard afterwards. And my brain was trying to send signals to my arm to draw, and it wasn't working. So my experience of like Mexican intoxication is from mezcal rather than tacos.
Sí, dice que realmente él no se intoxicó con los tacos. Más bien fue con el mezcal, que alguien le invitó a probar una marca propia de mezcal. Ya ven que hay un montón de emprendedores del mezcal, especialmente en Jalisco, entonces ahí es donde no le fue muy bien. So, Fraser, last time you were telling us this pretty cool story on how you got your first job at Who Framed Roger Rabbit, right? That was
Yeah.
so wild and so strange, right? Because nobody was, all your teacher and the grown-ups were telling you that your work sucks, right? And that
Kind
work,
of, yeah.
and those pieces of art were the ones that got yourself like your first job, right? At
Yeah.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit and at Disney. I had the doubt because I didn't think that was a Disney production, right?
Well,
How did that work exactly?
the advertisement that I answered in the magazine was, the heading was Walt Disney Animation, and it was a picture of Mickey Mouse. But if you look at the credits for the movie, when they released Splash with Daryl Hannah and Tom Hanks, because the Disney shareholders are traditionally anxious about everything being family entertainment, Splash was seen to be a little bit too adult. So they created a new company within Disney called Touchstone, and Touchstone was for like grown-up movies or grown-up animation. And then the other company that collaborated with Steven Spielberg's Amblin. So when you see the opening credits for Roger Rabbit, you see the Touchstone logo, and I'm not sure whether you see the Amblin one. I can't remember, but you certainly see the Touchstone logo, and then you see the credit for Roger Rabbit. But it was Disney. It was definitely Disney.
It's one of those things. Is the same thing that happened with The Nightmare Before Christmas? We've talked about that in the show. That was released by Touchstone as well. It wasn't the Walt Disney Pictures release, although it's from the same family. And nowadays, all the merch for The Nightmare Before Christmas is branded after Disney. But at the time, they were still same thing. They were afraid of releasing it for children because it was too much of a dark film for children.
And yet, most traditional fairy tales for children are very dark. There's a book that I still strongly recommend by a German writer called Bruno Bettelheim, and the English title is The Uses of Enchantment, and it's all about the psychology, if you like, of fairy tales and mythology, but it looks particularly at what we think of as the process of Disneyfication, as it was called, where you take all of the dark or violent imagery out of traditional stories. And Cinderella is an example. The ugly sisters in Cinderella get their eyes pecked out by birds. And, you know, these were stories that were told to children for thousands of years, and it didn't freak the kid. You know, I mean, maybe it did, but that was kind of the purpose. So Bruno Bettelheim is controversial because he was a survivor of both Dachau and Buchenwald, and his survival of the death camps was through his training as a psychologist under Sigmund Freud. So his perspective was very Freudian, and he was a pioneer in the field of studying autism, but he got it horribly, horribly wrong. So when you Google his name, there are a lot of people from the autism spectrum who are very hostile to his memory, but he wrote an extraordinary account of his war experiences called The Informed Heart. And he wrote this really magnificent book about storytelling and what the function is of storytelling, particularly for young children, and what the function is of darker imagery. So Bruno Bettelheim, The Uses of Enchantment, I recommend it.
Just written that
The Uses
name
of
now.
Enchantment. That sounds pretty good. Yeah. So when you started, like, so they accepted you, right, to work with them at Friendly Rabbit, and then what did you do? Did you have to go to LA, down to LA,
No.
how did that work?
Everything we did was in a building called the Forum in Camden in North London, and every day I would go and sit down at my desk, very like the one that's sitting in the corner there, which is I actually bought while I was working on Roger Rabbit. And we were the first day I was hired the same day as a guy I'm still very good friends with called Chris Jenkins, who's gone on to direct and work with DreamWorks, Sony, all these different people. And we had no idea what we were supposed to do. And they took us into a screening room. If you go onto YouTube and you type in, you can find the original test footage for Roger Rabbit. And it featured a different actor, not Bob Hoskins, as Eddie Valiant, going down the steps into an alleyway and Roger following him and lights flashing and cars going past. And again, it's difficult to get people in 2023 to imagine what it was like to see that in 1987. But when the lights came on after they projected it, there was just a whole bunch of us sitting there with our mouths open going, what was that? What have we let ourselves in for? That doesn't look possible. How did they do that? And then we were taken to our different departments because different people were starting for different reasons. And we were put into the special effects department with no idea even how to flip the 3 levels of paper. So Chris and I nervously looked at one another, and they put scenes on our desks and just kind of forgot that nobody had given us any introduction or whatever, and they left us to work it out. And after a few minutes of just staring at the desk, Chris said, "What are we supposed to do?" And I said, "Well, we're in-betweeners, and I think that means that if you take drawing number 1 and you put a blank sheet over that and put it between drawing number 1 and drawing number 5, then we put the backlight on the desk and we draw the one in the middle." He went, "Sounds like a good idea." So the two of us were both for almost an entire week trying to draw over the top page and draw we didn't realize that you were supposed. So this went on, and of course we were not producing a lot of work because we were going too slowly because we didn't know what we were doing. And I remember very clearly getting to Friday afternoon, and a lot of people used to smoke, and there was a guy behind me with a cigarette just standing looking over my shoulder, and he just went, "What the fuck are you doing?" And I kind of went, "Well, I think I'm in betweening." And he went, "But what?" He said, stand up. So he got me out of my chair and he sat down and he went, drawing number 1, drawing number 5, blank sheet of paper on top. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. Like, sorry, obvious. And then he showed us how to flip. And Chris and I were just like, red with embarrassment, kind of go, well, nobody told us. And so, yeah, I don't know if you want to stop and translate that part before I go further.
Fraser nos está diciendo que cuando llegó al estudio ya para animar precisamente Who Framed Roger Rabbit, era algo muy sorprendente. O sea, nos está diciendo que realmente es algo muy, muy sorprendente en esas épocas, en 1987, pues ver una película como esas, ¿no? Donde tienes gente real conviviendo con caricaturas. Entonces es algo muy raro que para la época, ¿no? Y también nos está diciendo que él en animación llegó y él no sabía qué era lo que tenía que hacer porque realmente no había animado. Él sabía dibujar muy bien, pero nunca había animado como tal. Entonces, cuando uno anima, él tenía que hacer los dibujos de en medio, los in-betweens, es decir, hay 2 dibujos, ¿no? Pon el dibujo 1 y el dibujo 5, y tú tienes que hacer todos los dibujos que están en medio para generar esa ilusión del movimiento. Y tradicionalmente eso se hacía, pones el dibujo 5, luego pones el dibujo 1 sobre tu escritorio y encima pones una hoja de papel blanco y entonces vas volteando los dibujos en un orden específico para que se vea el movimiento, pero ellos no sabían que eso se hacía. Entonces la lógica de Fraser fue: yo pongo el dibujo 5, luego pongo la hoja en blanco y luego pongo el dibujo 1. Entonces él estaba como intentando como que dibujar sobre la hoja 1, entonces era algo muy raro y no estaban avanzando hasta que llegó un animador y les enseñó cómo debía hacer el proceso de voltear los dibujos, que en verdad lo que se tiene que hacer es ver el dibujo hasta atrás, luego ves el de en medio y luego el tuyo, ves el de hasta atrás, el de en medio y el tuyo. Entonces así es como se tienen que hacer las cosas, pero nadie los enseñó y ellos realmente pues no sabían, y esa fue su primer como que lección dentro de un estudio de animación. What happened next?
I have a question for Fraser
Yeah, go
regarding
ahead.
the process. So you guys were working just based on a storyboard? Because you guys, I guess, I imagine you guys started animating before they even shot the film, right?
No,
Or
that
was it happening
kind
at the
of-
same time?
So the film was storyboarded, and the live action, everything was storyboarded up to a point. From what I understand, I never saw the storyboards. The only storyboards I've seen for Roger Rabbit are since. So I was hired into the special effects department, and when I was interviewing people for the book that I did about layout, I interviewed Roy Nesbitt, and Roy Nesbitt had been closely involved because he was working with Dick Williams for years before Roger Rabbit happened. And when Zemeckis and Spielberg came to London, according to Roy, they all met, and Zemeckis had been doing his homework about how they made Mary Poppins and Bedknobs and Broomsticks, and he said, don't worry, we know how this works. We're not going to move the camera very much, and we're going to keep the lighting simple. And Dick Williams went, no, you move the camera as much as you like, and we will find a way of making it work. And they had already developed a system, a guy called Chris Knott, who worked also with Richard Williams, where when you watch Mary Poppins or you watch Bedknobs and Broomsticks, all of the interaction between real humans and animated characters takes place in a parallel universe. So it's under the ocean, or it's in a magic island in Bedknobs and Broomsticks. In Mary Poppins, the chimney sweep makes a picture on the sidewalk and they jump into the chalk picture. And when they get to the other side, miraculously, they're all in very, very brightly colored costumes and they're very heavily lit. So what they would do is make the real people look flat and colorful so that made them look a little bit like cartoons. And they'd spun that around, turned it on its head with Roger Rabbit and said, no, this time the cartoons have to look three-dimensional. And the reason that they wouldn't move the camera is so that the perspective wouldn't change on every frame. Because if you're tracing a ground plane, because we were not just putting shadows on the character, like here I've got a light from this side and a light from that side, and I've got shading down the middle. It wasn't just putting that shading on the characters to make them look solid. If there is a shadow on a surface or an object cast by a character, we had to animate that too. So if the object or the ground plane of the wall is moving, we would trace all of the perspective of large black and white photographic enlargements of every single frame. So we were working with what were called photostats, regular photographic paper, which is not translucent. So you can't backlight it the way that you can with animation paper. So we would have to top light to keyframe and backlight to assist and in between. And it was nuts. But what we were doing was revolutionary, because everything before that had been, let's make the real people two-dimensional. And this was, let's make the cartoons three-dimensional.
Wow, eso está muy, muy loco. Básicamente lo que nos está diciendo Fraser es que con Who Framed Roger Rabbit, primero, bueno, tienen las escenas de la película como tal, las imprimen en papel fotográfico, las ponen sobre el escritorio y sobre el escritorio, sobre esa imagen ponen el papel de animación. No sé si han visto papel de animación, pero tiene algo que se llaman pegs, que son unos como pequeños pivotes,
Agujeros.
por así decirlo. Bueno, tienen agujeros las hojas de animación que se meten dentro de unos, ¿cómo llamarle a los pegs? How would you translate pegs?
It's a
pivote.
registration system, yeah.
Ajá, como unos pivotes donde que queda el papel exactamente ahí. Entonces, mira, Fraser nos va a enseñar. Eso. Eso que trae Fraser ahí es una peg bar, una barra de pegs. Entonces, si pueden verlo, tiene, si se fijan, dos como pivotitos alargados y uno en medio que es redondo. Entonces, sobre el papel se perfora de esa manera, se mete ahí y ya y ya no se te mueve, jamás se te mueve el papel. Entonces, las imágenes, las fotos que les imprimían en papel realístico tenían esas perforaciones, encima se pone el papel de animación y sobre eso, frame por frame, estaban animando. Y lo difícil, o sea, Robert Zemeckis, el director de Volver al Futuro y de Who Framed Roger Rabbit, trató de no mover la cámara lo menos posible para que ellos no tuvieran que estar animando las sombras, las luces en perspectiva, etcétera, porque eso es extremadamente difícil. Todo se tenía que dibujar a mano y tenían que hacer que los personajes se vieran tridimensionales porque, pues, los personajes reales, pues, obviamente son tridimensionales. No es como en Mary Poppins, que cuando Mary Poppins se meten en la chimenea, ellos ya tienen trajes muy coloridos, las luces son muy neutras y se ven más como un poco más planos. Aquí no. Aquí además es algo con Roger Rabbit es como de cierta forma un tributo al cine noir de detectives. Entonces también la luz de Roger Rabbit es bastante estilizada. No tanto como en el cine noir todavía, pero sí le pega un poquito a eso.
Pero lo que decía Fraser es que justo Zemeckis no quería mover la cámara, pero no sé si fue el director del layout que le dijo, no, mueve la cámara todo lo que quieras, porque más
Richard
bien
Williams,
nosotros...
que fue el director de animación.
Ajá, más bien él le dijo, sí, mueve la cámara todo lo que quieras, porque más bien lo que vamos a hacer es idear la forma en que las sombras se muevan con los personajes para darle esa tridimensionalidad e integrarlo. Eso fue lo que decía Fraser, que es lo revolucionario, que inventaron un sistema desde el departamento de animación para que la película sí pudiera tener movimiento.
So the way that we received the work in the special effects department, all of the live action had already been filmed and had been edited together. And each scene was blown up onto these frame by frame black and white enlargements. And the character animators would animate the characters, and that would be, the line would be, I remember the quality of the line artwork was just astonishing. Like I remember Chris and I held drawings up and like showed one another, went, how do you draw like this? We'd never seen electric pencil sharpeners before. You have an electric pencil sharpener
wow.
to keep your pencil sharp, but for the registration that was required in special effects, the sharpness from an electric sharpener wasn't enough. We all had pads of paper to make the lead even finer point because the registration was so precise. So we would receive line artwork of the characters, and we would be given by Chris Knott, the head of the department, a diagram that showed the angle of every light source that was relevant. And we would be able sometimes, not always, on the enlargements to see what the shading was like on the real character. If we needed complex movement where we had to follow shadows, we would have to go up to editorial and they would run the scene for us and we could see how the lights were moving. But what we had to do then was reproduce on every frame of every character all the shading in all its different levels. And usually that was a minimum of 2 elements. So there'd be one element that would make the darker area and another element that would create the edge light or the rim light. But often there were 3. And then when you see Jessica Rabbit with the sequin dress in the Ink and Paint Club, that's about 6 or 7 levels, all hand-drawn by pencil on paper. And then once it's all line tested, and to line test it on video, the only way you could see the shading effects, we had to turn the paper over and shade every frame in blue pencil so that you could see the shadows on backlit on the line test. And if it worked, everything went through to the matte and roto department, and they Xeroxed our line artwork for the shadow mats and the edge rim light mats. We called them tone mats. The darker mats were called tone mats. That went on to sell, and then it was all painted in black before it was photographed.
Oh, but it's good that the Xerox was already out there, because before the Xerox, that could have been a nightmare.
If they had hand traced it all, we'd still be working on it, I think. So, yeah.
Wow, that's so crazy. Sí, lo que nos está diciendo Fraser es que realmente el lápiz que ellos tenían que usar era un lápiz extremadamente delgadito. Entonces, fue la primera vez que él vio un sacapuntas eléctrico fue ahí. Y no bastaba con sacarle punta con el sacapuntas eléctrico. Había todavía que pasar el lápiz sobre un tipo de hoja que afilaba el lápiz para hacerlo todavía más delgadito. Y pues ellos recibían diagramas con las direcciones de la luz y ellos ponían la luz, pero lo interesante aquí es que para que tú puedas ver los efectos como se ven, ya que haces la línea negra, tienes que pasarle el lápiz azul para que se vea, y después tienes que hacer algo que se llama prueba de línea, donde tú hoja por hoja tomas foto, hojita por hojita, y ves, lo pones en un video y ves cómo se ve eso, ¿no? Ves cómo se ve. Y ya se puede ser aprobado. Y después eso se pasaba a unas máquinas de Xerox, o sea, de la marca de impresoras, donde las máquinas de Xerox imprimían
fotocopiadoras.
Eso. O sea, unas fotocopiadoras que imprimían eso, imprimían la línea nada más sobre el papel acrílico. Y entonces ya después a eso le das la vuelta y ya la gente lo puede pintar. Y vamos a ver qué nos va a enseñar aquí Fraser.
So
show us.
I found many years later, I kept a diagram that I made, the scene where Roger Rabbit and Eddie Valiant are handcuffed together and they're sawing through the handcuffs. That was a continuous scene with the moving light shade. And this is the diagram that I made to indicate to the assistants and the in-betweeners what the... how can I do this? What the movement of the light was going to be and how they were going to follow how we had traced the way that the shading was happening on Eddie Valiant's body, and duplicate that in the direction of the arrows, like which way it's going to recede and turn. So this was like a diagram for what it would look like, that each individual element was a single hard edge matte element built up, and then the softening of those elements was done in post-production by Industrial Light and Magic, who conveniently took the credit for all the work that we did as well, which I'm still angry about, but whatever, anyway. So we made a whole series of matte elements to darken and brighten areas of the character to make them look solid, and then that was comped in the United States ILM, but all of the actual work was done pencil on paper by a team of over 20 animators, assistants, and in-betweeners in London, in Camden.
Did you get to
Screw
work there?
ILM. We've never
ILM
needed them.
ILM are wonderful, but they never even mentioned Chris Knott's name when they went up to accept the visual effects Oscar. And during production, they returned his own diagrams and explanations to him like he was an idiot on ILM paper to make it look like it was all there. You know, he and John Leatherbarrow, the cameraman who shot everything, they sent all these detailed explanations of how this was going to work, to explain to them how this was going to be comped. And they put it all onto ILM paper and sent it back. It's like, what?
Wow,
And then
that is so
you
crazy.
listen to the commentary and they go, yeah, and then we added the shadows. And I'm like, no, you comped them. You didn't add them. We did that a frame at a time, a level at a time, a character at a time, a scene at a time, you know, which is why I still have a dent in my finger from the pencil. So I think they wanted at the time to make people think that they had more amazing technology than was actually available. But the fact that they never even thanked or cited him in the Oscar, I think, is a disgrace to this day. But what can you do, you know?
Yeah, that's a shame. Because sounds like you guys were like actively involved into making this work. Like it was not like a one-man show, right? It was a whole team working.
Oh, there was a huge
trying
team.
to figure how this whole new thing was gonna work
Well,
out.
the other thing you have to remember is that we were having to think entirely three-dimensionally. So we had to imagine the volumes and the forms and the anatomy that were being drawn by the character animators purely in line artwork. So we had to imagine and portray everything volumetrically. And actually, there's another example I can show you years later, a slightly similar technique, that in the sequence at the end of Tarzan, where Clayton and Tarzan are in the tree and Clayton has hung himself and there's all the lightning flashes, they ran out of special effects animators at the very end of production, and I had to go in and animate the lightning flashes on Tarzan's body. So you can see these were drawn in black on white paper, but then they were reversed out as individual elements. You know, he's down on the ground there. That's the light reflecting in the blade of the machete. That's him down on the ground. And we had, you know, with Tarzan, we had these muscle diagrams to work from as well, because you had to know where all the muscle groups were under the skin. So none of that anatomical detail is in the line drawing of the character animation or the cleanup.
It's all about the shading.
Yeah, and the special effects people have to know that that has to be in your DNA. You can't do that from a diagram or a book. You have to know how the human body is put together. So you know, what we were doing, even though the characters were less realistic and more cartoony on Roger Rabbit, it's exactly the same thing, that your job every day of the week was to imagine how these characters would look like if they were real and solid, and then you had to deliver that an element at a time as a darker or lighter matte element. And that was exhaustive, difficult work.
Yeah, it's basically painting muscles with shadows, right? You got to think about live drawing and how would light affect every different type of surface. It's a really complex thing to do.
And that was why I wound up in the special effects department, because when I took my drawings in to show to Don Hahn, he called Chris Knott and said, looking at this guy's figure drawing, I think you need him in the effects department because the lighting and the shading on his figure drawing, because I never drew from the nude as an outline. I always drew as a solid form, and I always looked at light. And that was why they hired me. No animation experience, but a knowledge of anatomy and structure and lighting.
That's wild. Fraser nos está diciendo, primero nos dijo que después de cuando hicieron Who Framed Roger Rabbit, en los Oscars, no les agradecieron a ellos, todo el crédito se lo dieron a Industry of Light and Magic, que pues era la empresa de George Lucas de efectos especiales, ¿no? Que ahorita le pertenece a Disney. Entonces ellos se quedaron todo el crédito y no mencionaron realmente al equipo que estaba en Londres, pues trabajando, que eran más de 20 personas haciendo los efectos, las luces, etcétera, que es uno de los más grandes méritos de la película, tanto así que pues ganaron el Oscar por efectos visuales. Y pues no los mencionaron y eso los enojó mucho. Sí tienen crédito en la película, pero fue bastante triste eso, ¿no? Que quisieran pretender que tenían tecnología mejor de la que realmente tenían. Y luego Fraser también nos enseñó, estos dibujos que nos están enseñando son de la película de Tarzan, que él trabajó realmente haciendo todas las sombras y las luces, cómo se verían sobre el cuerpo de Tarzan, porque ya tenían la animación de Tarzan, pero plana, no se veían los músculos. Entonces ellos tenían que conocer muy bien la anatomía humana para poder diseñar cómo se vería pues las luces y las sombras sobre los músculos de Tarzan. Bastante loco eso.
I have some examples of the same technique, but used for a commercial for breakfast cereal, where they had these little bullets that came out of a gun, and each bullet was a caricature of one of the Hollywood actors who was famous for being an on-screen gangster. So what we would get on our desk was line artwork. So this is a caricature of the actor Edward G. Robinson. And in this case, there was light from both sides of the character. So we would have to isolate the area that was darker, if that makes sense. And then we would have to shade it in blue on the back. So when you then composite that together with the peg registration, so you put that onto your peg bar. So if you put the darker element behind the character like this, and then you put the character drawing on top, and you light it from behind, what seems to be two-dimensional from the front, when you light it from behind, you see how it begins to look three-dimensional?
Yeah, exactly. This is a great visual example for the audience because this explains pretty well what you were saying about Who Framed Roger Rabbit. You were basically adding layers to the characters to represent each portion of the shadow, right? Each different portion. You mentioned that for Jessica Rabbit, you were using sort of like 6 layers or something. So it was like
6
a
or
really
7
complex compositing work.
And then when you're putting the light that's hitting the side of the character, it's also done as a closed line mat like this. So you have to define the area and then close off the artwork for each element that's going to be, these are the areas of the character that will be lighter. Sorry, my lighting setup in front of my desk here is not very good. But if you look at the level of like sharpness and detail on that's very, very precise artwork, and it's also way more detailed and like takes much longer to do one of these drawings than it takes to do a clean frame of character work, because there's just so much more information and it has to be believable and round. And so our work was much more expensive and much more time consuming than the character department, because there were more people involved, more levels involved, and more detail involved. And that was a popular look after Roger Rabbit for any television commercial that was advertising using animated characters. And it used to be legal to do that for breakfast cereal, toilet freshener, kitchen cleaner. So anytime a cartoon character jumped off a box or off a plastic bottle into a bathroom or into a kitchen, we were the people same team that made Roger Rabbit effects, we were the people working at Passion Pictures who duplicated that for so many, like Count Chocula, Zucaritos, Cinnamon Toast Crunch, Cornflakes, Rice Krispies, Mr. Proper, like you name it. For years afterwards, all the advertisers that used animation wanted their animation to look like Roger Rabbit, and we did that for a long time afterwards.
Did you get to work with Richard Williams? Like, do you know him?
So Richard Williams, I was introduced to him the first week that I arrived because I used to work previously for a producer called Richard Goodwin. And Richard Goodwin had been part of a consortium of people trying to raise money for a Dick Williams Thief and the Cobbler film. And when Chris Knott read my resume and saw that I'd been working for Richard Goodwin, he took me upstairs to introduce me to Dick Williams. And I then also became good friends with Dick's daughter, Claire, who still works in the animation industry. And the last time I saw Dick was at Annecy in 2018. And he sadly died the following year. But I introduced him to the Pixelatl team. His animator survival kit had been translated into Spanish. So he and his wife, Mo, were optimistic that they might be able to come to Mexico to promote the Spanish edition of the book, but he passed away in August of the next year. But I have this weird, interesting story about spending his 80th birthday having dinner with him, which I can tell you next after you translate, if you like.
Básicamente, Fraser lo que nos dijo, puta, a ver si no se me olvidó. Me quedé en lo de... bueno, él nos estaba enseñando con todos estos dibujos las sombras, cómo a ellos les daban el dibujo de los personajes y ellos tenían que dibujar cada parte de las sombras, cómo iba a golpear la luz cada parte de los personajes. Ellos tenían que hacer eso porque después de Who Framed Roger Rabbit, toda la gente, o sea, cada vez que había anuncios de televisión, de cosas animadas, ya saben, o sea, que salía el cepillo de dientes y brincaba en la bañera, o salía el muñequito de la caja del cereal y brincaba sobre la mesa del desayuno, ellos, ese equipo, tenían que hacer todo eso, todo lo que hicieron en Who Framed Roger Rabbit, era el mismo equipo que hacía todo ese tipo de comerciales, porque se puso como de moda hacer todo eso después de Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Y le pregunté que si él conoció a Richard Williams. Richard Williams fue el director de animación de Who Framed Roger Rabbit, que escribió el libro del Animator Survivor Kit, o sea, el kit de supervivencia del animador, que es el libro más famoso de animación que existe, es como la Biblia de la animación. Todo aquel que estudia animación tiene que estudiar muy bien ese libro, leer ese libro, hacer los ejercicios de ese libro. Entonces, es como el Baldor, el álgebra de Baldor, pero de la animación, el Animator Survivor Kit. Entonces, Fraser nos está diciendo que pues sí conoció a Richard Williams, trabajó con él, conoce también a su hija, que todavía pues está en la industria de la animación trabajando, y pues tenían planes de venir a México. Le presentó a la gente de Pixelatl para traducir el Animator Survivor Kit al español, que sería muy, muy útil, no sé por qué no lo han hecho. Y pues desafortunadamente Richard Williams pues murió en el 2019, y bueno, ahí en los Óscares pues lo mencionaron. Ya saben que siempre cada año mencionan a la gente que murió y pues mencionaron ahí a Richard Williams, pero gran animador, leyenda de la animación también. Y pues el legado de Richard Williams yo creo ha sido como el de nadie más en la industria de la animación, justo por ese libro y por Who Framed Roger Rabbit. A minute of silence for Richard Williams.
Wonderful man, really. And I don't think we would be having this conversation if it were not for Richard Williams, because Roger Rabbit's success kick-started a renaissance for animation and inspired people to do more and work harder and reach for higher quality in all areas. And it really was a huge catalyst for what happened in what we now think of as the second golden age at Disney, and then what happened when Warner Brothers and DreamWorks were able to go into competition with Disney. So I think most of what's happening globally in animation is directly traceable back to the success of Roger Rabbit, which itself we owe to Dick Williams' determination.
Yeah, and
which year was Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
It was released in 1988.
1988, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that was, yeah.
And how long were you guys in production? Well, post-production of the film production?
So the work that I did, I think if you looked at our timesheets, I think it would be safe to say that we did 2 years' work in 9 months,
Oh
something
wow, that
like
is
that.
pretty wild.
It was a lot of overtime, and it was a very short time span. It was less than a year, and I'm pretty sure it was about 9 months in all together that we worked on our part of it in the effects department. And but if you look at the actual hours spent, that would probably have stretched out to like regular hours for about 2 years. I think I would estimate.
How did you end up like after Roger Rabbit? What happened next, like with your career?
Well, we did a lot of television commercials that looked like Roger Rabbit. So when Dick Williams was running his studio in Soho Square in London, um, there were two young producers working for him called Alan Dewhurst and Andrew Ruman. And Dick wanted, if the movie was successful, he wanted never to have to work in advertising again, because he wanted to complete The Thief and the Cobbler. So as soon as the success was clear of Roger Rabbit, he took, I guess you would call it a Rolodex, the file with all your business contacts, and he kind of pushed that across to the desk to Alan and Andrew and went, "You want to do some advertising animation? Go ahead." So they had all of the industry agency, creative agency, client connections for all the work that had been done at Dick's studio. And Passion Pictures was set up with two Canadian animators, Andy Knight and Chuck Gamage, who were amazing multitasking character animators who could storyboard, direct, layout, whatever. And it just so happened that because Roger Rabbit had such an impact, although people wanted like animation of all kinds, predominantly they wanted Roger Rabbit style animation with cartoon characters wandering around in the real world. And so Chris Knott was hired by Andrew and Alan to head up the special effects department because that was the look that was required. And so Chuck and Andy ran the character animation side, which also involved a stable of other amazing character animators like Philip Valentin and Mike Burgess. There was an amazing number of people, and they used to recruit from Sheridan, so they'd get young character animators in from Sheridan like Mike Burgess and name will come back to me. And we just had our effects team making everything look like Roger Rabbit. And so, but what was interesting there was that although ILM were still using optical printers and kind of laboratory processes to composite the Roger Rabbit movie, what I noticed was that all the post-production that was happening on the TV commercials that we were doing, it was still being shot on a 35mm rostrum camera, but then all the negative was being digitized at a company called Rushes in London, which was owned by Richard Branson. And then it was being put together digitally in what was called the CIS, or Composite Image Suite. So Rushes had all these different floors in central London, and they had all the Quantel paint box and Flash Harry digital manipulation tools. But the Composite Image Suite was the one that we used, and that was another company from California that knew how to digitize the film elements, and then the compositing was done digitally. And it was at that moment that I realized what happened in my father's industry of newspapers, print and publishing with the digitization of typesetting, that is now beginning to happen. The technological change to digital computer work is happening in my industry. I have to do something about this. So in 1993, I moved over to working with Cambridge Animation Systems on their pioneering system, which was known as Animo. So I did lots of advertising work, and then I went into working in software as a matter of survival, because I could see that the end was in sight, that if this was possible, and there were also there was a lot of progress being made in computer animation. And I was paying attention to this. I was buying all of the industry magazines and reading up. We didn't have the internet, so you couldn't just follow stuff online. I would have to get specialist magazines and industry stuff and read about what was happening. So I had followed all the movement and progress in computer animation in wireframe since I'd seen the first documentary on television. And I could see that this was going to change everything. And it had already changed the technology of the editing and sound effects editing that I had been doing previously. And I thought, we can't stop this, so I need to get on board with the digital process.
So you knew Toy Story was coming.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. If you want to translate that part, and then I'll tell you how I knew Toy Story was coming.
A ver, ayúdanos con eso, Mazo.
A ver si me acuerdo de todo, pero nos contaba igual que justamente ya terminando lo de Who Framed Roger Rabbit, estaban pues viendo que venía, ¿no? Y que a partir de eso ya pues todo lo que tenía que ver con animación querían, y con publicidad en animación en general, querían también la estética de Roger Rabbit. Entonces querían que la calidad se viera con eso, o sea, fijaron un nuevo estándar para la animación. Y era un trabajo pues bastante choncho, de ahí es lo que decía, ¿no? Que pues por eso mucha de la gente se involucró en ese tipo de publicidad, porque pues era lo que necesitaban. Pero a partir de eso que también él empezó a ver cómo cambiaba la industria, y cómo se metían las nuevas tecnologías, porque pues antes manejaban pues todo de la manera tradicional, pues con sus cámaras sobre los dibujos 35 milímetros que pues van haciendo las fotografías, pero él veía cómo ya la tecnología se empieza a meter ahora en la industria de la animación, que es lo que nos contaba en el episodio pasado. Su papá vio el cambio en la industria del periodismo y cómo se cambiaron las técnicas de impresión para los papeles. Entonces ahorita veía eso en la animación, que ya no solo era como se toma la foto y se pasa a la lámina, ¿no? O sea, ahorita ya veía cómo ya se empezaba a digitalizar también todo este proceso, y que él pues recordando justamente lo que le hizo su papá, que era no te pelees con la tecnología, pues empezó a suscribirse a todas las revistas de la industria y estaba leyendo todos los, donde podía, de lo nuevo que estaban haciendo, y se empieza él también a meter con las nuevas tecnologías que están llegando. Entonces también se mete con los desarrolladores de un sistema de Cambridge, right? It was Cambridge?
The company was called Cambridge Animation Systems, and the software was called Animo. And it was eventually kind of bought out. Somewhere buried deep inside Toon Boom Harmony and all the 2D cutout stuff, the kind of source code is still traceable back to Animo. The idea originally was a vector-based automatic in-betweening system for what we now know as like digital cutout animation. But there were problems with it. Let's put it that way. And at the end of 1993, there was an enormous amount of pressure from the companies all around the world who were interested. And Cambridge Animation Systems had a lot of competition. There was Tic-Tac-Toon, there was US Animation. There were lots of systems in France, the United States that were trying to do the same thing. And the kind of holy grail at the time was how to take, and this seems crazy now because people are so familiar with this as something that's available on every portable device. But if you took a line drawing and scanned that in, how you could digitize the line artwork so that the computer would understand a closed area as being something that could flood with color. So you would take,
yes, you can bucket paint it, right? Like in
exactly.
Harmony.
And the people who ran Cambridge Animation Systems were very focused on the vector side and what could happen there. Almost by accident, they had developed some extraordinary software for camera, for compositing. It became one of the first node-based compositing systems. But they were resistant to the pressure to develop digital ink and paint, because they were much more focused on the vector part. And ultimately, the UK user of the software that was the biggest investor in the software, they had a partner company in France, and collectively they said, if you don't develop this, we will go with another system. So they very quickly implemented this at the end of 1993. It went live in 1994, and DreamWorks bought it, Warner Brothers bought it, and suddenly it was just like off and running. So it was a really interesting period.
And do you consider, Fraser, this as something that affected the craft, the artistry behind the craft of, in the aesthetics, at least of animation? Did it improve it? Like, how do you consider it as something that impacted the craft?
I think John Lasseter was right when he said that the artists motivate the programmers and the software inspires the artists. It's kind of a cyclical thing. But the pursuit of excellence is the pursuit of excellence. It doesn't matter if you're cooking food, designing cars, or engineering or whatever. And I was really lucky because, you know, what I was interested in as a student and as a teenager was what I considered to be visual excellence as the Renaissance artists had practiced it. What Dick Williams was interested in was animation excellence. He wanted to push the medium beyond where it had ever been. So in the 1970s, he brought Art Babbitt, Grim Natwick, Ken Harris from the golden age of Disney, Warner Brothers, Hollywood, and they came to London and gave these master classes, not only to Dick's artists, but to the artists at other animation studios. So what was happening with Cambridge Animation Systems was happening against the backdrop of what Roger Rabbit had made possible, because the animation industry itself was growing and expanding and more people were creating more animated content. And it's easy now to forget just how far music video pushed animation. If you look back at the Peter Gabriel Sledgehammer video, the different parts of that were animated by the brothers Quay, by Aardman, that was a huge showcase and a huge shot in the arm for stop motion animation. And music video, Annabelle Jankel and Rocky Morton doing all their videos for The Art of Noise, and Elvis Costello, and, you know, the guys at Hibbert Ralph animating the It's a Kind of Magic video for Queen. There was just a ton of animation suddenly, not just in advertising, not just in children's TV entertainment, but in music video. And music video was really, really pushing. And one of the first times most people saw computer animation was the Dire Straits' Money for Nothing music video, which now looks comically simple and crude. But it was one of the things that really made me realize that Toy Story was not far away, if that makes sense.
I remember getting very, very amazed. Like, the animation works that have amazed me the most are probably music video, at least at the beginning, right? When I was way, way younger. I remember the video of A Freak on a Leash by Korn, that it was animated by Todd McFarlane, Todd McFarlane worked on that, right? Like, and not the animation probably, but the storyboards he directed. I think the video, and also the first time I saw a Gorillaz, right? The band, the first.
Well, the Gorillaz, that was done by Passion Pictures because Andrew Ruman was friends with Jamie Hewlett. And interestingly enough, since you mentioned Todd McFarlane, one of the last bits of training that I did, because my job was to train people how to use the Animo software, and I went all over America and Canada, and I was in the old Hanna-Barbera building in Los Angeles for 2 weeks in 1994. And one of the people, there were two people that worked on Spawn, the comic with Todd McFarlane, and they were using what the Animo system could do for color, for print. So I was teaching Bay Rate, and Bay Rate went on to do all the facial rigging for Gollum in Lord of the Rings. But the first time that he was manipulating software was the Animo package when he was working for Todd McFarlane. So there's lots of like interconnection during that particular period of development of the earliest software packages.
I was also thinking, I think Kraftwerk was one of the first bands that started using 3D animation for their live concerts and also for their music videos, I think. And yeah, I've never thought about that, how the music video industry pushed the film language quite a bit. Like, if you go all the way till like the modern era, you think about a Spike Jonze or a Michel Gondry, those are music video directors that started pretty much experimenting with the image, and now they're like huge names in the industry. And I never thought about the impact of that, and that link between music videos.
It had a huge impact. And the first time I really paid attention to what was happening with computer animation, the BBC in the UK had a science documentary series called Horizon. And one evening, I think in 1981, and I graduated in 1983, on BBC, there was a documentary called Painting by Numbers. And it was all about, it featured Ed Catmull, had a lot of the early pioneers. There was an early attempt to create an animated feature film called The Works. And they had this footage, which now looks ridiculously crude. And they were looking all the way back to the first gaming technology with Pong, with just the flat graphics and the green screen. And then, of course, you had Ed Catmull making the human hand that could turn around. And you had the young Sherlock Holmes movie where the knight from the stained glass window came out of the stained glass window and had a sword fight with somebody. So there were lots of people working with digital technology, and again, like Lucas developing the edit droid, to digitize the picture and sound editing process. So I was so excited every time I saw another development. And again, it was like luck. You would be sitting in somebody's house and something would come on the television. It's like, hold on, stop. What's this? What's this? And the first time I went to America was in 1984, and I spent 5 weeks at New York University on a 16mm film course. And one of the facilities that we went to visit had been involved in the Money for Nothing video, and they played it, and everybody just stood there going, oh my God, this is like, where is this taking us? And it does look ridiculously simple now. But, what happened at Pixar, it was inevitable. It was going to happen eventually, and there were a lot of people heading in that direction. And it was in my DNA because of my dad that I just kept my eyes open for these changes. And your question about whether it affected the quality of animation, the quality of the artwork, I think it's a difficult question to answer, because I'm not sure that technology ever has that impact. I think it depends on who is making use of the toolkit. A tool is a tool. A pencil is a pencil, a pen is a pen, a computer is a computer. It depends on the determination and the imagination of the people who are using it and how far they choose to push the technology towards excellence. There are the other race to the bottom people who are looking at the technology and going, how can I make this faster and cheaper? But fuck them. I mean, like in every generation, there's somebody who's looking to do something exploitative. But I think that mostly the animation technologies that became available, including Animo and then later Maya and all, I would go to NAB, like the National Association of Broadcasters, to demonstrate Animo, and I would see on other stands what was happening with the other companies that were developing Softimage, Alias Wavefront. So, and I went to SIGGRAPH, so you would see, everybody was having the same conversation. And the last time I was at SIGGRAPH was 1994 with Animo, and a year later, in November, December, Toy Story, the first Toy Story movie came out. And it was still fresh in people's minds when we were just starting work on Space Jam. So it was a very interesting transitional period. But I think it was completely inevitable.
Yes, like you saw the wave coming.
Yeah, and SIGGRAPH is a great place, like to to be aware of the technology that is out there. I remember meeting there like Tim Weber, like the guy who made all the visual effects for Gravity, right? He won an Oscar for there, and we went to his conference when he was giving us all the breakdown and the technology they use for Gravity, and that was amazing. Like,
do you remember when they used to do what was called the Electric Theatre on the last night? So I remember when I was at SIGGRAPH in Orlando in Florida, and they gave, you went into this enormous auditorium with this enormous screen. And if you went to the right-hand side, you were given a green paddle. And if you went to the left-hand side, you were given a red paddle. And they were interactive, reflective devices. So the whole audience was playing a giant game of Pong on the screen. And that was like the opening of it. And people were, you know, it was very, very simple, but very fun. And then the big climax was the visual effects team from Jim Carrey's The Mask. And they had the bit of the movie where the dog puts the mask on and the dog goes crazy. And everybody just went apeshit. They were like, "Oh my God, this is on another level." And, you know, that was...
That's a good point, because I've never thought about it. The Mask could pretty much be the Who Framed Roger Rabbit for 3D animation integrated to live action, right? Probably that was like the first successful case that we saw of that experiment.
And also it was very far ahead of its time because it was squash and stretch. And, you know, the reason Toy Story is toys is that it's easier to model and animate hard surface objects. And the reason that in 1996, 97, they had to abandon the first version of Shrek was that until... I remember being at Disney the day that they screened Jerry's Game, where you have the Jan Pinkowska short from Pixar with the old man playing chess against himself. And I remember people looking at the facial muscles on that character and going, "Oh my God, that is just like such a huge leap forward," because you look at the facial controls and the muscular controls on the humans in the first Toy Story film, and, you know, however charitable you want to be, it's a tough watch. But what they did with Jim Carrey in The Mask was so fluid and so, you know, based on all the Tex Avery extremes. And but again, you know, that was a very limited number of shots in a live action movie, whereas Toy Story was like every element, every frame for an hour and a half. So like that was a bigger mountain to climb in lots of ways. But, you know, props to the people that achieved what they did on The Mask. It was amazing.
Otra cosa que quiero decir para la traducción, porque ahorita estaba viendo y YouTube sí tiene una opción para poner subtítulos en diferentes idiomas, y al parecer funciona bien. Entonces, la gente que ahorita está viendo en vivo, mejor para que fluya esto y que no se nos acabe el tiempo y aprovechar mejor la sabiduría de Fraser, vamos a dejarlo en inglés, pero yo voy a poner la opción para que haya subtítulos en español, que de hecho siempre tengo esa opción activada porque todos son en español. Entonces esa opción ya está activada, entonces cuando ya estén viéndolo en diferido sí van a poder verlo con subtítulos en español.
Tenemos unas preguntas en vivo de Andrés Ortiz y entonces...
Andrés Ortiz dice, se ve que es un buen maestro. He looks like he's a great teacher. I would like to learn from him. I can notice that he has a lot of passion for everything he teaches. And he's asking, like, for an animator, what is the most difficult, like, to create something in a small gap of time or to modify something because
pressure of the market?
Yeah, pressure of the market. And have you ever felt like they're kind of destroying your creations because of that?
This question comes up a lot, you know, the art versus commerce question. And you know, I've been a very, very lucky person, the projects that it's been possible for me to be involved in. And I choose to see it that way because I've had an extraordinary series of opportunities to work on some amazing projects, but I have had absolutely zero creative personal contribution to any of them. None of them are my designs. None of them are my artwork. I'm constantly required to adapt and perform according to somebody else's criteria. That's all I have ever done in my animation career. The one occasion where I wrote, designed, animated, laid out, storyboarded in my whole working life, I've created less than 3 minutes of animation that's like, I would say, was my designs and my artwork. And even there, that was tailored to a particular company and a particular need and a particular level that the artists could animate at. Because animation is labor intensive, and you know, your question is a very sensible and very important question, Andres, and I don't mean to make it sound like I'm dismissing the question, but being individually creative is really not what we do. There's a very small number of people in the animation industries in any area who do the creative work and are hired and recognized for their input. But even their input disappears in the mix. So for example, if you watch Ratatouille, you look at it and think, oh, this is amazing. Everything is so beautiful. Who knows the name Carter Goodrich? But if you go to Carter Goodrich's website and you see the influence that he had on the character design for Ratatouille or the character design for Despicable Me, he's a very important artist and nobody knows who he is unless you're in the industry and you're interested in character design. He's also a very, very successful commercial illustrator. So he has done over 20 New Yorker magazine covers, and the New Yorker cover illustration is the most prestigious illustration on planet Earth. So a lot of people do more than one creative job. So some people design for the animation industry, but also have their own illustration careers. And that's true for Bill Joyce, Peter DeSev, many, many people. And I think there has been a kind of upsurge of interest in like auteur television animation with Mike Hollingsworth and BoJack Horseman and Rebecca Sugar and Steven Universe, and you know, shows like Gravity Falls and Owl House and all those things. So a lot of people coming into the industry, they tell me they want to be showrunners and they want to have their own television series and they want to write and direct it. Those are all great ambitions. But even if that happens, you have to sustain a career over 40 or 45 years. And that requires you to adapt. It requires you to keep learning, and it requires you to compromise. And there is no adult human existence without compromise. It just doesn't exist. And a lot of people are very purist in their idea. I don't want to, dilute my vision. If that's true, I would not recommend commercial animation, and I wouldn't even recommend experimental or indie animation, because somebody has to pay for it. You know, it's an expensive process, and as soon as somebody makes an investment, they have a say in how it's going to look and who's going to see it and where it's going to be marketed. So the idea that you can pursue a kind of individual, independent vision, technologically you can afford to, and you can do that now, and you can create animation without any control and any compromise, as long as you can afford the machinery and the software to do it. And you can still do whatever you like with paint and pencils, and and do that on paper or do that on canvas and work as an illustrator. But what comes into the question is, who is paying for this? And how do you live from what it is that you do? And I think the closest comparison I can make is that I've been like a session musician. You can have great ability on a guitar, but if all you play is Spanish nylon string guitar, that's the only work you're going to get. But if you can also do like Steve Vai fret shredding heavy metal solos, or you can play like Brian May or John Williams or any of these people. You're going to get work every day of the week. And after Roger Rabbit was finished, I did not have a show reel because I'd only worked on one animated project, and we couldn't show anybody the work because the movie hadn't been released. And there were about 200 people going around London looking for about 12 available animation jobs. And the only thing I could show people were the drawings that I showed to Disney. So I was still carrying that portfolio around. And, you know, the reaction I got was, I like how you draw, but I don't care how you draw unless you can draw like the person who's the art director on the next project. So you're constantly required to shapeshift and find out, which is great because you learn other people's tricks and other people's techniques, and you grow in what you're capable of doing yourself. But a lot of people are very anxious that, everything's going to disappear and I'm going to be destroyed by the commercial demands. I can't say that that's been my interpretation of what's happened to me, but I haven't really left my fingerprints on anything that I've done creatively because my job is to be invisible. And
yeah, because it sounds first like you found your creative freedom still within those corporate jobs. At the end of the day, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the product of a huge corporation, right? And still you were able to achieve like creative freedom. Well, that's how it sounds to me. I don't know if that was your experience.
Well, my creative freedom happens in other areas. And really, since I moved to Guadalajara, I've felt more creatively active than I ever have done. During the time that I worked on Tarzan, I was in a band. So I was the singer in a band called the Chili Dogs. And the bass player was Tim Allen, who animated Donald Duck on Fantasia 2000 and animated Emperor Cusco on Emperor's New Groove. The drummer was Dave Burgess, who animated the genie on Aladdin and the hyenas on Lion King and Professor Porter. Chris Jenkins, the guy that started the same day as me and Roger Rabbit, he was the guitar player.
All the stars.
And we
sounds like a
recorded-
good band. Sounds like a good band.
Hold on.
El Juanco me dice, hola, soy nuevo en este canal. Bienvenido, Juanco.
We recorded an entire double album of original material. So we created a lot of our own songs, and we had to have clauses written into our Disney contract so that Disney didn't own our music. But we wrote and recorded, and we performed live, and people came along and got up and danced, and that was great fun. And I love recording. During the pandemic, I have Ableton software on my MacBook, and I recorded a bunch of songs on my own and made little videos in my apartment here in Guadalajara and put them up on Patreon, put them up on YouTube. And every week I go out drawing 2 or 3 times to, my friends who are musicians here in Guadalajara are all, they're like my models. So everywhere I go, I draw musicians. I just take my pen and my sketchbook, and I sell the drawings, and we raise money for a cancer charity. So I get to be creative in lots of different ways. And this is late in my life, and my goal is not to be rich or famous. Is just not to waste a day. And I think part of the difficulty is that the aspirational goal for a lot of people who are interested in a career in the visual arts is they want everybody to pay attention to them and tell them how clever they are all the time. And that doesn't happen when you're working in animation. Nobody's got time to stop and tell you how amazing you are. They're just glad that you've finished the work, and then you move on to the next thing. So I think there's a lot that's happened with social media where you have people who are like star concept artists or star designers or whatever before they're 25 or 26. And that kind of gets into everybody's system. They, I want to be like that person. I want to do tutorials on YouTube. And it's just kind of, slow down. You've got your whole life in front of you. And the people that from my generation who did get famous, I don't recommend it. It's it's not a particularly great existence. So I think that the idea of having to compromise, yeah, you do, but it doesn't mean that you are prevented from being creative on your own terms. It's just you have to do it on your own time with your own money. And if the two things connect up and you become well known as at a particular level, well, that's okay. But it's okay if that's what you want. But I think a lot of people who want fame and recognition have no idea what a pain in the ass it is once you get it, because you can't get rid of it. And I don't know
Also,
if that answers.
I think that answers the question very well. But also, like, I wanted to talk a little bit about your book, because your book in the animation industry is like a holy grail, right? Like, really, like, I don't know if you knew that, but your book is pretty famous. But it's famous because everybody's talking about it, but nobody has gotten to see it, right?
So
It's so strange.
the book came about in a very unusual way. When I finished work on Tarzan, I didn't have a green card, so I had technically, I think it was like 10 weeks or so, no, 10 days to get out of the country, because I wasn't an American citizen. I didn't have a green card. I didn't have permission to work on anything else. So I got an immigration lawyer to, I paid a lot of money to be permitted to stay for another 6 months, hoping that I might get picked up by another studio, and that didn't happen. And I went back to the UK, and shortly after I failed to set up my own company, my mother and father had retired to the north of Scotland, far from anywhere. And my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and then my father was diagnosed with cancer, and then he developed heart condition. He lost his eyesight. Their situation got rapidly worse and worse. And I was already being invited to teach at different universities. When I left Scotland in 1985, nobody was teaching animation, certainly not for the commercial industry. And when I got back in 1999, 2000, everybody was teaching animation, but all they had done was buy the software, and they had no idea how animation actually got made. So I was constantly being called into places to help try and improve the relevance and the quality of the animation teaching they were offering, but I couldn't go back into production work because so much of my time was being spent trying to support my mother and father. And people imagine that our health system in the UK, like you get everything that you need for free. That is not what happens. And the way that they were, it was an eye-opening experience. And early on, I was very angry and resentful that I was having to give up my career, which I had built up over many, many years. 15 years in the industry and 5 years of training. So 20 years of building up to where I was at Tarzan. And all of that was taken away from me in less than a year. All of it. My savings were gone. There was nothing I could do. And I was traveling long distances every week to try and be with them and make sure that they were okay. And it took over. But the layout book, when I was invited to start doing the teaching work, I realized that I myself was not trained as an animator. So I had never learned about movie making or animation or the history of any of it. And I thought, if I'm being paid to teach these skills, I have to teach myself all the stuff I don't know about the history of animation and movie making. And I was trying to find good books on different subjects. And of course, Richard Williams' Animation Survival Kit came out, and for character animators, that was amazing. But there was nothing that explained scene planning, camera, environment design, lighting, color. None of those books existed. And I could find books about visual effects and storytelling and map painting, whatever. And in some books, there were beautiful examples of layout artwork and background artwork, but there was never an explanation of what I understood the importance of layout to be. So I started asking my friends in the industry and sending emails and going, I'm trying to find a book that explains the importance and the purpose of animation layout. am I being a dickhead? Is there a book out there and I just can't find it? And all the people that I asked gave the same answer. They said, the book doesn't exist. It would be great if somebody could write it, but it's going to be really difficult to write because everybody has a different definition of layout. So even within Disney, the layout pipeline for Hunchback of Notre Dame was very different to the layout pipeline for Tarzan, which was not the same as the layout pipeline for Lilo and Stitch, whatever. And I had a friend who was working for Chronicle Books in San Francisco, and she had moved from Scotland to the publishing industry in America at the same time as I had moved from London to the movie industry. And they had started doing the Disney and Pixar art of books, and they had also done an amazing book about the history of matte painting on glass by Mark Cortavaz and Craig Barron. And it was an amazing book. And I wrote to my friend and I said, okay, there is a missing book on animation technique. You are a publishing company. If somebody tells you there is a space on the shelf where an important book should be, what is it that you guys do to create that book? And she said, well, the process is a subject editor looks for an author and a researcher to create this. And the subject editor for this particular book would be a guy called Matt Robinson. And he's really busy at the moment. So I can copy your email to him, but don't expect an answer. And that my friend, her name is Shona Burns. She's still working in publishing. So Shona forwarded my email and I was like, I'm not going to hear from this guy for like months. 20 minutes later, my phone rang and it was Matt Robinson in California going, I want to do this book. And I'm like, pardon? And he said, what have you written before? And I said, I no, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting I'm going to write this. I've never written anything. And I said, but you'd be perfect. You know all the people, you've worked at all the studios. They'll trust you to do that. You know, why don't you? He said, look, why don't you? And I said, you stop there. Stop there. I said, my mother and father are dying. My mother is dying of dementia. My father is dying of cancer, and I am their sole carer. So the idea of me launching into this, that's not going to happen in a hurry. And he went, oh, I'm very, very sorry to hear that. Well, do you think you could do a sample chapter, you know, just when you have time, and maybe suggest a structure for the book, and maybe, you know, ask some people at the studios if they would agree to participate? And I said, well, I'll try. And I mentioned it to my father, and my father said, you are going to do this, you know, because he was a publisher and an editor and a writer. And he said, you have spent all these years looking after your mother, looking after me. We're both going to die, and you are going to go back to your world, and you haven't worked in the industry for a long time. And if you take on this book, that could be a great opportunity to reconnect you. And I think you can do a good job of it. And so I started work on a suggested structure for the book. I started work on a sample chapter, and I began calling people and writing to people, and everybody said yes. Everybody. Disney said yes, Warner Brothers said yes, Sony said yes. So I was able then in October of 2007 to send, and I got quite into it. So I made a really good looking package. I did a lot of color printing, and I did a lot of typesetting, and I made it look as professional as I could. And I sent it off to them thinking, you know, they're going to find somebody to write it. I'm going to wind up doing the research and whatever, but this is going to be a long time in the future. And I knew they were having a meeting about it in October of 2007, and I heard nothing until February of 2008. And I received an email from them. I'm not making this up. My mother was taken in an ambulance in a neck brace into hospital. And as the ambulance was leaving, I got ping, email. So yeah, we have this budget. We want to do the book, and you've got a green light, go. And I had to write back and say, So my father has just been told he has only 18 months to live. My mother has just been taken away in an ambulance. This is part 2 of me saying, I'm not really sure that I'm going to be able to do this in a hurry. And they were very accommodating, and they said, in your own time, no pressure, but the money is there and we want this to happen and we want to support you in doing this. And I was like, okay. My mother died 6 weeks later, and my father had been told that he wasn't going to live much longer. And my father was still fit enough that it was possible for me to arrange nursing cover and social services cover so that I could travel to the United States to interview people. So I used the first part of the money from the book to spend, and they all originally wanted Japanese layout to be covered, and that didn't happen, but I did spend a week in Tokyo. So I spent 5 weeks in America interviewing people, and every day phoning my father back in Scotland, checking that he was okay, sending him emails, letting him know what was happening. And I bought lots of books and things that I needed for the thing while I was in America. And then I went back to Scotland, and some friends that I was teaching for gave me a desk space. So in the morning, I would go over to Dundee in the car. I would get up at 5:45. I would prepare my father's medication and his breakfast and prepare for the people coming in to look after him. I would drive to Dundee. I would start work at 7 a.m. I'd put the headphones on. I'd listen to all the interviews that I'd recorded with all the layout artists, and I would transcribe the parts that I was going to use for the book. And that took me, I think, 1.5 years of transcription work, every day getting up at 5:45 and going and doing this. And they wanted a manuscript of 48,000 words with 300 illustrations. But every single illustration needed a copyright and image licensing clearance, and it needed a payment. And I had to do all of that too. So when I finished the manuscript, I had a lot of placeholder images that were not the final images in the books, but I'd visited the archives and I knew roughly what was available and what we could have that hadn't seen before. And I expected them, because I handed in a 63,000 word manuscript for a 48,000 word contract, I thought they were going to cut lots of bits out of it and send it back. And after a few weeks, they wrote back and went, no, that's fine. And I went, pardon? And they went, we like it. We love it. It's okay. And I went, but it's 63,000 words. And they went, yeah, that's okay. We don't mind. And I said, but that means more illustrations. 300 illustrations is only going to cover like 48,000. And I went, oh yeah. So yeah, 400 illustrations. I said, well, that's 400 copyright payments and image licensing agreements. And they went, yeah, you'll do that too. And I was just, what? So I had to spend another 12 months sending printouts to all the legal departments of, this is where your image will appear. This is the text that's going to be next to it. Do you approve? How much is it going to cost me? And that took a whole year working on my own. And you may remember earlier in the story that my father was supposed to die, and my father lived for another 5.5 years. So he lived through the whole process of me researching the book, writing the book, and then he was there when the first copy arrived at the house. And he got to open the first copy of the book. And then people wrote nice things about the book, and he got to see it well reviewed. And then he died in 2013. And he died in June of 2013. And the Edinburgh Film Festival had invited Richard Williams and his assistant Neil Boyle, and through me, Roy Nesbitt, the layout artist, to come to Edinburgh Film Festival and celebrate his 80th birthday. And my father, who was in nursing care for the last 6 months of his life, and I was visiting him every day, said, you must go. This is an event, you must go to Dick Williams' 80th birthday party. And he said, it doesn't matter what happens, you've got to go. And at 7 a.m. on the Friday morning, I got the call to say that he had died in his sleep. And the next day was the celebration of Richard Williams' 80th birthday. And all I could do on the Friday was meet with the funeral director, the minister, and there was nothing more I could do. It was already planned. And my father wanted me to go. So I got permission from Roy, Neil, and Dick and said, will you feel awkward if I come to the celebration, knowing that my father has just died? And they said, no, you'll be very, very welcome. And they put me right next to Dick Williams at dinner, and he was so sympathetic and so generous and kind. And he spent most of the evening telling me about his relationship with his birth father, who was very distant from him. And I took my copy of the book because I have a teaching copy of the book, but I have a fanboy copy of the book. So my fanboy copy goes with me every time I'm going to see somebody that was interviewed, and everybody that was interviewed signs the book. And when I got to meet Dick Williams, we had tried to interview him and he wouldn't answer. And the word on the street was that he was angry that Roy Nesbitt was getting so much attention from the book. And Roy was nervous that Dick was going to be angry at him. Dick wasn't angry at all. He was in fine form and he was in wonderful mood. And when I showed him the book, he said, oh, I bought the book. I've got a copy of the book. He went, shit, now I've got to read it, because I've met you. So his signature in the book says, now I'll read it. Congratulations, Dick Williams.
Oh, that is so great. It's so good that you got to be friends with him.
Well, and then the sad thing, he knew me as one of Claire's friends. So when we were in Annecy, he was like, oh, we need to do a selfie to send it to Claire. So I've got this really goofy selfie of me and Dick Williams that we sent to his daughter. And then, of course, he died just after I came to Mexico. And then Roy Nesbitt died in April 2 years ago. And I was just so fortunate to meet and record the experiences and the skills of all these people. And I was blessed also that, one of the last things that my father knew was happening was that I was getting to reconnect with these people and with my world. So it was a nice way to say goodbye to my father.
Okay, I'm sold. I need a copy of that book.
Oh man, good luck.
It went out of print in July 2018, and it's very expensive. The copyright has reverted to me. Chronicle Books are not interested in a second edition or a reprint. Another publisher is interested in reprinting it if I can write a second volume that covers all of the things that have happened since the first one was released, and probably more with Unity and the Unreal Engine. Probably more has happened since 2011 than had happened in the 100 years leading up to the publication first time round. But I would need somebody to finance the research and the writing of the second part. And I've begun doing some Zoom interviews with people. So I've interviewed some people, but I don't at the moment have the time or the resources to do volume 2. But the reason for doing it was this needs to be recorded before this information disappears. And a lot of the people that I interviewed, it was the last interview they gave was for setting the scene, like Ray Aragon and Victor Habouche and these people. And I could only include a small amount of the information that they shared with me. So I am kind of custodian of a lot of advice and knowledge that I enjoy sharing because I don't feel it belongs to me. I was very lucky to be the recipient of it, but I don't feel like I can sell that knowledge to people. I mean, the transaction is that I teach and I get paid to teach, but I want, where possible, to make that information available to the people that need it, which is the people who are the next chapter in the history of animation, which is all these amazing young people here in Mexico and across Latin America and other parts of the world. But I was very, very lucky to get the chance to do that. And I feel kind of thankful and responsible at the same time, because now that it's out of print, there is an online archive.org digital copy, completely illegal, but I'd rather it was available so that the information is not hidden. And I've never made a penny out of the book, and the publisher never made any money out of it. It was a labor of love. I've just lost money hand over fist ever since, but I don't care, because it's I just feel very honored that I was the one that got the opportunity to do it. And I didn't really write it. I got the information from these people and I edited that together.
Yeah, you're the curator, but that also has like a huge merit, right? Because it's about preserve the information that
Sure.
you already did. So I think the second part needs to be curated as well, because you were mentioning those people are gonna leave anytime
Yeah.
in the future, and that part of the story will be lost. So
No, I
if you
I
need
would
any
love
help,
to.
I think we could help out with anything. So now we
It
got
would be.
Zoom. Now it's cheaper. We don't need to
It,
travel.
it
Think
would be
about it.
great. It'd be great to. Well, I think ultimately you kind of need to go places and sit with people and talk to them. I mean, it is technologically possible to do it a different way, but I think that personal connection makes a difference to the quality of the information that is shared. So I hope I get the chance to do it, and I hope I have the time
What
and the
about
energy.
we do instead of being a book, like we do a documentary with.
So I'll tell you why. Because the image licensing and copyright costs for moving image on a documentary are even higher than they are for print. So
Oh wow!
at the time that I was doing the book, I was approached by a company in London about doing a history of animation documentary, and they backed off when they realized what it was going to cost, because every time you get a few feet of film from one of the classic animated things, it's a lot of money.
But I
Unless
think
you
it's
can.
different unless you're not trying to make a commercial film. Like if it's for
Fair
academic
use.
purposes
Fair
and you
use.
just post
Yeah.
it on YouTube, I mean, you can get
So
away with pretty much anything.
I hate to burst your bubble, because we did go through all of this. I mean, one of the biggest problems was that because the internet is not governed in the same way, a lot of the imagery that we wanted to use, it was already available on it was hard work to find images that had not already been pirated. That people would not have seen this artwork somewhere on the internet before it was in the book. But fair use for academic and teaching purposes is a tough argument in the context of documentary. I'm good friends with Daniel Raim, the guy who made Harold and Lillian, A Hollywood Love Story, and who's made all the amazing films about Robert Boyle and Haskell Wexler and Harold Michelson, all these people. And he has like cornered the market in being able to do this for live action. But animation, when I was doing the book, a lot of the other animation historians, like the real animation historians and writers, were, you don't do a book about everything because you have to negotiate with so many different studios and publishers. And we almost lost at the last minute all of the Thief and the Cobbler material, all of it, because Miramax and Disney were changing, like the ownership of the Thief and the Cobbler was changing all the time. And it was purely because at the very last minute, somebody at Miramax went, don't bother, just put it out there. It's okay. We're not going to do anything. But we nearly lost an entire chapter of the book at the last minute as it was going to the printer in Hong Kong. So the
Wow, that's
legal
crazy.
stuff, and because it was done by an American publisher, if I had done it with a publisher in Europe or the United Kingdom, the publisher would have held responsibility for all of that side of the work. And because it was done with an American publisher, I had to do it. And I had nobody I could delegate to. And I couldn't do that again. I just couldn't. I'm too old. I haven't got the energy. But
Fraser, like before we go, like you told us briefly an experience where you were, I think, working at Space Jam, and you got to meet Chuck Jones. Like probably that could be a good anecdote for the audience to listen
well,
to.
it was shortly before Space Jam, so it was while I was still working for Cambridge Animation Systems, and one of the people that took a very real interest in the system was Bill Croyer, and Bill Croyer was working on an animated Christmas special with his wife Sue and a team of animators. But the Flint Ridge earthquake destroyed their animation studio, so they had to relocate to a temporary premises. And we were about to fly to SIGGRAPH in Orlando, and I was with Bill Croyer and Sue Croyer and their team in a rented space on Chandler Boulevard in Los Angeles, where the landlord wouldn't let them use the air conditioning after 5 p.m. and none of the windows could open. So they had this like huge corridor full of polystyrene sheets and canvas to try and direct cold air into the area so that the machines wouldn't overheat and pack up. And I was in the dark and it was very late and we were working. There was a scene where there was a circus animal. There was a lion in a cage and somebody was closing the door and we were using the animo vectors one frame at a time to cast a shadow over the lion. And it was very, very dark and very, very hot and quite late in the evening. And I heard Bill Croyer behind me while I was doing this and went, "Chuck, this is Fraser. Fraser, this is Chuck." And I looked up and I saw this guy and I went, "Hi." And he said, "Can you explain what you're doing?" So I explained what I was doing and they left. And 10 minutes later, one of the guys in the room said, "Oh, it's so great that we get to work with Chuck Jones." And I was like, "You're working with Chuck Jones?" They went, "Yeah, you just said hello to him." And I went, "That was Chuck Jones? Like, why did nobody tell me?" Like the guy that where is he? Like, and it was too late. And I had zero idea that he was in the building. And it was very dark and, he was tall and I could see he had a bow tie on, which was like his kind of signature thing. But I was so immersed in the work. And then when I did the book, I got to meet his daughter, Linda, and I got to meet his widow. And they were so generous with their time and they let me have artwork and they didn't charge me and they were amazing. They were just absolutely fantastic. And there's a really goofy picture of me holding one of Chuck's original Daffy Duck drawings, just going like I'm so excited, like a kid in a candy store. But yeah, so that was
that was a huge fan moment then.
It would have been. It should have been.
Yeah, of course. And you mentioned that you also met Spielberg and Zemeckis. Like you guys got to meet both of them.
Well, Zemeckis and Spielberg were around at different intervals while we were making the film. But when they go into the Ink and Paint Club, there's an octopus washing glasses and selling drinks behind the bar. Myself and Chris Jenkins were working on the octopus. And Patsy DeLorde, who was like the production manager, brought this guy up in a baseball cap and asked us to explain what we were doing. And I was like, "Well, this is a real bitch to do because this is across several sheets of paper and it's very difficult to flip and whatever." And he was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And then minutes later, she came up and went, "You're supposed to say positive things to Steven." He's like, and I'm like, "Steven?" It was like, "Steven Spielberg, the guy that was behind you while you were doing the octopus." And I'm like,
"Oh, Fraser, you have to pay attention to who
I'm never there. I'm just like always somewhere else." But
I think he might have appreciated, right? Maybe you gave him like an honest input into the into the work that it took to make his precious film.
I think from what I understand, and I've got a lot of friends who've worked very closely with him. And he just wants to make movies, and he just wants to be around people who make movies, and he just loves what he does. And he's very not famous. He's very not Steven Spielberg. Like he's not like, "Do you know who I am?" And like he's just completely not. He's very unassertive in that way. So he just turns up and drinks coffee and talks to people, and he's just very enthusiastic and very, very sharp and very informed, as you would expect him to be. But yeah, Zemeckis was around. There's Polaroids of other people in the department with Zemeckis, but I didn't get to meet him. And, I missed the chance to meet a lot of the 9 old men. Mark Davis was still alive. Ward Kimball was still alive. Frank and Ollie were still alive. There were, and I always felt when they were at the studio, the last thing they want is somebody coming up and going, "Oh, I think you're wonderful and you've been such an inspiration." Because it's like, But I'm lucky because I've got to know Ted Thomas, who's Frank Thomas's son, who made the Frank and Ollie documentary, and also Walt and El Grupo, the documentary about the trip to South America. And I met a lot of great people through the Disney archive.
Did you meet Glenn King when you worked in Tarzan?
Yeah, Glenn. Well, the first time I met Glenn Keane, I went to the Paris studio while they were still working on Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I was introduced to him because I'd signed the contract to be artistic coordinator, and Chris Jenkins was in Paris, and he took me in to say hello to Glenn. But Glenn was working on Tarzan in Paris the whole time, so it was only on occasions that he came over for story conferences or meetings. So he wouldn't remember me from a crack in the sidewalk. But yeah, lovely guy. Very completely quiet and humble and unassuming, just not like a star.
I have a very
Tool.
interesting story with Glenn King because like he always, when he gives his conference, he draws the beast right in
Yeah.
front of everybody, and
Yeah.
while he is explaining how
Mhm.
he got to design the beast and decided, etc. Right, how the character was going to be. So when I was in Vancouver and he gave a conference there in a very small room. We were a very few people, like we were like 20 people just with Glenn King, right? And he drew the beast, and I came forward right away before the conference was over, and I asked him if he could give me the beast, right? And he said, "Oh, sorry, I'm giving it to your animation history teacher because he asked in advance for it." And I was like, "Oh, okay, well, no worries." And like 2 years later, probably, I have a very good friend that he has nothing to do with animation, like nothing at all, right? And he told me, "Oh, I have something that my girlfriend gave to me that maybe you will like it. So I don't know, you come to my place and I give it to you." And he gave me, a roll, right? How you call these boxes, like
Yeah,
that
like a
cylinders
cylinder.
where
Yeah,
you put,
yeah,
yeah,
like a
right?
tube.
And when I open it, like I open it and it was like it was the beast with the made with pencil with the signature of Glen Keane. I was like, what the heck? Like I was like, how did you get this? And say, "Oh, I don't know, my girlfriend, she went to some convention of technology and animation stuff, and she asked for
Amazing.
this, and she thought about you because you work in animation. So, oh, probably my boyfriend's friend will like this because he's an animator. So can you give the beast to me?" And he said, "Oh yeah, you take it." And he gave it to me, and that was so strange. Like
How
I got it from.
fantastic.
It was meant to be. It was meant to be.
It was so weird, so weird. So I have an original
I'm
beast.
very
Yeah.
envious. Very envious. There's a
Yeah.
couple of questions came in from El Gunaco just before we finish.
Well, his I think his first question, like en las obras que ha trabajado, puso cosas de su vida en las obras. Like it pretty much is the question that
Is there
Andres,
something
like,
of yourself that goes into the work?
yeah, exactly.
Yes, always. That's what
And Mao is
we're.
cheering for you, Fraser. He's like,
Oh, hi,
"Grande,
Mao.
Fraser."
Hi, Mao. Yeah, thank you again, guys, for inviting me. It's really kind of you, and I feel as lucky to be here in Mexico as I felt lucky to be in Los Angeles working at Disney and Warner Brothers. I think what's happening here in Mexico and Latin America is very important and very inspiring, and I really, really want, where possible, to provide whatever advice or support I can, again, in the pursuit of excellence. I don't think it's sensible to pursue the idea of let's be an inexpensive labor force for. No, let's not. let's be Dick Williams. Let's be Walt Disney. Let's be Hayao Miyazaki. Let's be good and make work that will identify for the rest of the world what Mexican animation looks like and what the identities are of all the different cultures that, when you talk about Mexico as a country, if you go back through history and look at all the pre-colonial, pre-Columbian work, you have this absolute treasure trove of cultural material and reference and stories and narratives far beyond what people think of in terms of the caricature of the Dia de Muertos or the sombrero or the
Speedy
cactus.
Gonzalez.
Well, Speedy Gonzalez is kind of cool because he's like this. I wish we had like the Scottish equivalent of Speedy Gonzalez because he's kind of like this renegade hero. Like he flipped from Arturo Hernandez is presented at Pixelatl in September, and when he announced that they're going to be doing a Speedy Gonzalez project, the whole place went crazy, and they're like, "Oh yeah,
That's
we
true.
get to kind of like reclaim this character and make him ours." And I think that there's a lot of potential for remarkable things to happen, and things that are already recognized, like, you know, Speedy Gonzalez is globally known, and even if people don't like the caricature, it's a great figure to draw people's attention. And this is a great figure to be reclaimed by a guy like Arturo. But you look at the originality of Jorge Gutierrez's work and Sandra Ikiwa's designs. You look at what Robin Morales has created with El Tigre Sin Rayas, and you look at what is happening with stop motion with people like Jennifer Skarbnik, and you know, the work that's been done by the big names like Guillermo del Toro. That's wonderful. But you look at Los Hermanos Embris and Frankelda, and you see what's happening with companies like Marco Animation and Mighty, and there's an enormous talent pool here and a fantastic potential, and no need to duplicate the weaknesses or failings or errors of the other industries. But I think that's why I really want to encourage people to pay attention to the history and the structure of the industry. I think a lot of people are imagining that they can do original animation and bring down capitalism at the same time. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that you can create original animation that will help to bring down capitalism. I'm fine with that. But I think a lot of people are worried about the tension between art and commerce, and concerned that, you know, they may run into problems of being exploited or ripped off. The way to not be exploited or ripped off is to do the homework and get legal representation. Don't go into contracts that you haven't read and understood. And if you can get legal representation that can help you negotiate the contract instead of just signing the first draft of it, always think carefully about where you put your signature, because once it's on the paper, it's too late. And a lot of people are, oh, I'll sign a contract if I get to work with this company or that streaming service or this studio. Never sign anything that you haven't read and understood. And if you can't understand it when you read it, hire a lawyer who can. And don't think that the world is not waiting for what you have to offer. And don't think that you can't generate revenue and profit with what you make. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry for video games, for television, for feature films. And if you're the ones creating the content, ain't no reason somebody else should be pocketing the money.
True. I think as a third world country, since we didn't have this industry like the States had it 100 years ago, for instance, like we are late in the game. We had this perspective on the industry as something we do for passion, and there's no chance until maybe the early to mid 2000s, we were still thinking that we had to do the craft for passion, but there was no way even in our wildest dreams that we were gonna be able to make money out of it, right? Now with the streaming explosion, I think we started to realize that there's a lot of hunger for content, and I think that's waking up a lot of creators in different corners of the industry, and we're just starting to generate like a more healthy industry, but we're pretty late in the game.
Well, I think what's important is to remember that the generation of wealth does not have to be the generation of wealth for a tiny number of people who had the advantage in the original contractual agreement. If you look at it in a more collective way, then it can be the generation of wealth that you can reinvest in your own productions and in your own team. One of the things that people often trip up on is that you put all your time and all your energy into getting this project made. Well, what happens after that project's made, whether it's successful or not? If you've built up a team of people who are employed and skilled in doing that work, you owe it to them to have other work available for them to move on to when the big project is finished. So it takes an enormous amount of planning and management, and you cannot implement a non-existent plan. So I would advise anybody that's thinking about projects, don't just think about projects, think about building and maintaining the teams beyond a single project, and having a group of different types of client and work that can keep you busy and not mean that you have to lay off your team after the big effort is made on the big video game or the big series or whatever it is. But we are not yet training people in contract law, resource management, human resource, all this kind of stuff. And that will make an enormous difference. If all we teach is creative skills and technical skills, that is a recipe for fuga de talento. It's like saying you go out and work for all the established companies, but if you want to establish a truly competitive company or studio, then you need to be working with people who genuinely do understand the industry and who do understand the way that the money flows. But an enormous part of the conversation that you're touching on, what I recommend to everybody is to read the David Putnam book, The Undeclared War, which was written in 1997. And it was about the fact that the movie industry in America developed as a business, and in many other parts of the world, it developed as art. And then people go, well, why are we not making as much money as Pixar? Because that's not the structure that you bought into. If you want to make as much money as Pixar, don't just read the Ed Catmull book, read the Lawrence Levy book, and read, this is very, very well documented. Nobody can claim that the information is not available. It's freely available, but most people don't pay attention. They're too busy wanting to be creative. Well, everybody wants to be creative. I want to be creative, but I would also like to pay the rent. And I don't feel like I want to spend the rest of my life holding my hands out and hoping that some agency will give me the money to do something simply because I want to make a film. If I'm wanting to make films, then I'm an entertainer. And if I'm an entertainer, I have to entertain. And if people are not entertained, I need to work harder. But this idea that, oh, we're artists and we don't need to make a profit, I don't buy that at all.
No,
Sorry.
not at all. I think we've had that misconception as a culture, at least here in Mexico, for
Scotland too.
100 years now. For 100
Europe,
years,
Scotland. It's not just Latin America. It's pretty much everywhere apart from the United States.
Yeah,
that's why they're
is.
still up there. And you look at Japan. Japan has its own kind of self-contained market. Their output can survive on the Japanese population alone. But it's also, since the wider distribution of anime and manga and everything, they're doing great. But they're not having to, but that industry has problems too. People working 18 hours a day and sleeping under their desk. I don't recommend that. So, if people genuinely want to build something where they can create, manage, and control their own original IP, you have to do the homework. And as a creative or technical person, you have to work closely with people you know and trust who understand the legal, financial, and organizational realities. You cannot get by on passion. The word passion comes up far too often, and it's used far too carelessly. We're all passionate. Everybody cares about what they do. It's not some kind of, weird thing that, oh, I'm so passionate and I'm so clever. Human beings are passionate. The word enthusiasm comes from entheos, the divine spark, the God within. It's part of us. We're enthusiastic creatures. But passion alone is not going to get you to the finishing line. And I'm sorry to say that that's true, because it would be great if we could all just live in a big sandbox and play around all day, but that's not how it works. And I wouldn't want to misrepresent the reality that I have lived through by pretending that it was, because it isn't.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. If it wasn't true, like nobody would do documentaries about like John Ford or people like that, because that will be a normal thing.
I also don't think anybody should feel that they have to apologize for wanting to make successful, popular, commercial entertainment, because it's the hardest thing on earth to do. And that it's easy to hide behind the idea that, I'm better than that. I'm an artist, so I don't have to. The fewer people see my movie, the more that means that I'm a different kind of human being. I just think that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. And because I've seen and I've worked with some of the auteur people, and I never want to be in a room with them again. It's
Totally.
they're not my type of person, I'm afraid. I would rather be around people like Glenn Keane and all these people who, they're passionate about what they do too, but they are in a context where they can turn that passion into something that touches millions of people. And if that makes money, then they reinvest that money in making more movies that touch more people. I don't think that's bad.
Not at all. Well, in this show, we've talked a lot about the franchises, for instance, like how many franchises are pretty cynic in the sense that they probably just want to grab people's money, but still, even the art of just pursuing the commercial success, it's pretty tough, and you still gotta put images on the screen, and that's like a huge achievement. And we're pretty cynic in this show. We tend to, this show is called El Cine Se Fue a la Mierda, so obviously we gotta be cynic about the things we don't like, but still, there's a huge achievement in making a film or any piece of creation, period, right?
Even making a shit movie is really difficult.
Yeah,
I know.
absolutely.
I've worked on a lot of shit movies, and it's a lot of hard work, and it's a similar amount of work. So why not work on something good? There is no inherent nobility in something nobody wants to watch.
Yeah, totally.
true.
That's a good point. Like, if you're still gonna, if you're gonna put the work into it, why not making it good, right?
Yeah,
putting
exactly.
the extra work into making it good if you're already gonna work on it, right?
Yeah, I agree. And also, for me, one of the things that I feel most fortunate about in my life is the way people light up when they find out that I worked on Who Framed Roger Rabbit. It was less than a year's work in my whole adult life, and when people connect with what's in the book, and people have copies of the book, the Roger Rabbit in the book and those other things are, that's largely my involvement in somebody else's creativity. But the fact that people love that movie and find something to enjoy or to use in the book, I just feel I can't ask for more. That's a great thing. Nobody can take that away from me. And I didn't direct Roger Rabbit, and the book is very much the work of the people that I interviewed. But I'm a little part in a larger process, and that's okay. I'm fine with that. I don't have to be. I don't have to be anything other than that. It's a great feeling to have been able to participate in things that people still enjoy all these years later, and I feel very, very lucky for that. And because that's such a great feeling, I want everybody here in Mexico to know what that feels like. I want everybody here to know that their work is being seen everywhere and that people love it. And that's happening with, you've got El Ángel en el Reloj and Disfraz para Nicolas on Disney+. You've got Frankelda on HBO. The world is waking up to way more than the existing established names of Jorge Gutierrez and Guillermo del Toro and Alfonso Cuarón. All of them wonderful, but there is an enormous landscape of other people waiting to share their work and their vision of these things with the world. And I think that's extremely exciting. And I feel very lucky to be around while it's happening.
Yeah, I think with that, with those great words, we can say goodbye for now. And it was so good to have you, Fraser, here with us.
Thank you for the invitation.
Para la gente que quiera saber más de Fraser McLean, aquí en la descripción del video están toda su información, todos los enlaces para sus redes, para Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, todo. Ahí está, LinkedIn creo que está su página de IMBD si quieren saber más. Entonces ahí están todos los enlaces para que vayan y sigan a Fraser y aprendan más de su carrera y su trabajo. Y pues nos vemos la próxima semana, but I don't know if you want to say something before we leave, Fraser. Like, we really thank you
thank you to Alan Mace. Thank you so much, Rolando, for the invitation. I'm just it's great to have the opportunity to join you guys, and I love what you're doing with the podcast, and I love the attitude that you bring to it, because I think it's important not to be too serious about all of this.
Yeah, we don't want to be serious.
You can drive yourself quietly crazy. So thank you, Rolando, for the invitation, and thank you for helping keep people cheerful and positive about everything that's happening.
Yeah, no, thank you for your time, and yeah, you are really inspiring. Like, I think I can relate to a lot of things that happen to you that are happening to me, and sometimes I feel kind of small, right? Like working as an animator, right, full-time animator, and you see your credits right on the screen, but it's like it's nothing really creative about my job. Right now, I'm working as a rigger, right? I switched from being an animator to be a rigger, and because I know there's way less riggers than animators, so I say like I want to learn this and I want to have a more secure job, so I switched to be a rigger and now I'm rigging, so which is pretty cool. But still, like I can totally relate to that, and that cheers me.
I think
A lot,
also,
so.
there is a lot to be said for knowing as many of the jobs in the pipeline as possible. If you want ultimately to direct or produce or whatever, it's good to know what's involved. So spending time doing any of those jobs, even if it's not your number one chosen job, go for it, because it gives you a far more thorough and rich appreciation of what everybody around you is having to do day in, day out. And that keeps you level, which is really important. I think one of the most disastrous things is when people start, turning themselves into some kind of legendary figure or some kind of. I think it's much healthier just to be quiet, anonymous, get on with the work, make it beautiful. And, if people turn up and say thank you later on, that's great, but that shouldn't be why you're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much again, Fraser, y muchas gracias por haber estado aquí. Seguramente si están viendo esto en diferido ya lo pueden ver con subtítulos. Nos vemos la próxima semana. La próxima semana tenemos, ya saben, la entrepierna de Dios el martes, y tenemos el cine se fue a la mierda, como siempre todos los miércoles. Entonces, cuídense mucho por favor y vean mucho cine. Nos vemos la próxima semana. Adiós.